This podcast was recorded on the ancestral lands on Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and the Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation.
This is Humans on Rights, a podcast advocating for the education of human rights. Here's your host, Stuart Murray.
Today on Humans on Rights, my guest is Max Brault, a national leader in accessibility, inclusion, and disability rights. Max, who grew up with a rare condition called spinal muscular atrophy, has spent decades helping governments and organizations remove barriers and build spaces where everyone can participate fully and with dignity. He's also the author of a new book, The Race to the Starting Line, a powerful exploration of what true accessibility looks like and why equality must begin long before the race even starts. Max Brault, welcome to Humans on Rights.
Thank you, Stuart, for having me on board.
Max, we're going to get talking about the book. We're going to get talking about a lot of things, Accessibility Canada Act, so many things that you've written about and you've lived. But before we do, I always sort of just like to throw it to my guest and say, I'm delighted you're here. Max, tell us, the listeners, a little bit about yourself, and then we'll get into your book and a lot of other things personally. But just give us a little background on who Max Brault is.
Well, first of all, for any of your individuals who are blind who are listening in, just want to give a brief description of what I look like. I'm a gentleman of 55 years old with what my wife and I call blonde hair, a white beard. I have blue round glasses. I'm wearing a purple shirt with a really knockout bow tie. And repeat the question if you don't mind.
Yeah, just and by the way, it is a real knockout bow tie. I must tell you, it looks fantastic as long as your shirt. Max, just a little bit about who you are and just your background from a personal perspective before we talk about some of the advocacy work that you've been so active in.
Yeah, so as a young man, when I first started this journey around 40 years ago, I realized with having spinal muscular atrophy, which we commonly call as SMA, I realized I was going to be entering into a workforce with a world that's not prepared for people with disabilities. So at first, I chose to take the entrepreneurial route, which most of my family was in an entrepreneurial spirit. And then eventually working with disability organizations, getting into the federal government, and helping to influence a lot of key people to look at people with disabilities as a particular angle for dealing with the unemployment that's been happening around the country, that there's a lot of talented people with disabilities. And I was helping the federal government in hiring a lot of people with disabilities, and then moved into changing policies and all that kind of fun stuff. At the end of my term in the federal government, I ended up working on something called Bill C-81. And I worked about 4 years on that particular front, which would end up becoming the Accessibility Canada Act. And then I left there and I went and worked for the, what I jokingly say, the dark side. I went and worked for corporations for BDO Canada at the time and learned how to be a consultant and took everything I learned from being a federal public servant and created a very successful business line with BDO Canada.
So, Max, you've had quite an experience. Thank you for laying that out, the background, and particularly, I think, on the issue around Bill C-81. One of the things I was just asking, kind of in my own mind when I was reading and looking at your book is, how did the act come to be? What's its purpose from your perspective and the advocacy behind getting C-81 into law in Canada?
Uniquely, I say this in my book, and I've been saying this for a long time. The Charter of Rights says, thou shalt not discriminate against people with disabilities. But the reality is it does not explain to corporations or businesses or people, what does that mean? What does that look like? And again, how do you apply this for education? How do you apply this for work? How do you apply this for, building environments? There's very complex problems that need to be solved, but also there are some solutions that need to be addressed. And again, the other thing is that we started seeing around the mid 90s, you started seeing provinces coming up with their own legislations. And the problem is, in my opinion, it's great to have the provinces doing their legislation, but we'd also need the federal government to do their own version of it as well. Because what you don't want is an organization to say, Well, I'm a federally regulated organization, so I don't have to pay attention to the provincial stuff. And so my philosophy and a lot of other people is if you have a provincial, get a federal, so then all aspects are covered.
Right.
That's what, the bill was supposed to intended to do, cover close to 19,000 federally regulated organizations.
So on that far, Max, was there a province that was, in Canada that was leading the way that you thought, this province is doing a good job, or, at least they're doing something. We need to do a better job, and therefore we need to do something from a federal stand and call it the Accessible Canada Act. Was there something that you thought was going on that was worth mentioning?
Yeah, Ontario at that time had a piece of legislation, a provincial legislation that was in for a good little while. And not only was it in there for a while, but they had enough that when we started talking to the Ontario government, we realized that they also had some experiences of what was working and what was not working. And so we were able to take that back to our table and go, okay, with Ontario's experience, what can we avoid and what can we build on? And I have some examples. Like one of the best examples of that is don't go around and dictate to people what needs to be done. You need to come up with a lot of regulations and documents that explain to people what needs to be done. For example, built environment. Really explain, how wide does a door need to be? How, what are all the specific requirements? Because at the end of the day, just saying you need to be fully accessible, again, you go right back to what I was saying about the charter. You leave it open to people to interpret, and that's sometimes not what you want to do. Sometimes it's better to lead people and say, here are the key things you need to keep in mind, and then run with it.
Max, one of the questions always, I think, with these issues, we always love to sort of talk about the charter and equality of rights and all of that. The reality is a lot of times people, particularly in the disability community, they don't seem to have a voice until there's a breaking point, as opposed to somebody, and I love the way that, I'm going to ask you about how you came up with the title of your book. I think I know. But the point is that sometimes you look at something rather than looking ahead and being proactive. You wait until it's almost like, hey, the house is burned down. There was a fire. Gee, maybe we should have a fire department. Why is it that you have to have such bad examples to understand where does the dignity and the human rights of these elements come in at the beginning?
That is a question that I think has existed since time immemorial from human rights. The number one problem is, Stuart, is even if we have legislation and regulations, we still live in a law society where everything is going to be challenged and has to go to courts. And really, many organizations might not abide by the law until it's been challenged. And the courts actually go, yeah, we agree with what was written. And we've seen that all the time. We've seen that with the Indigenous folks. We've seen that with the gay and lesbian communities. And now we're seeing that with persons with disabilities. And one other thing for your listeners to know, the number one group that they received more complaints from were persons with disabilities in the working environment. I think the ratio I was hearing, it was like for every one that was from somewhere else, they would have 5 for persons with disabilities in the working environment. So it was clear that there was needed to be some kind of federal legislation and provincial legislations to follow through to start explaining what that needs to be done in the employment scenario.
So advocacy is a big part of what I try to sort of talk about in this podcast, Max. Taking action, people that are interested in trying to help others or trying to get involved in organizations. So talk a bit about, if you can, the advocacy behind creating the Accessible Canada Act, or Bill C-81 as it is known.
Well, the odd thing is it was the first Trudeau government, and he sent out those notorious letters to all his ministers at the time. And Minister Coltrane was in the place of minister responsible for persons with disabilities. And she was told one thing. She was said, go in and get a pulse from the nation of what they think the act should look like and make it happen within the 4.5 years. And so for the first year and a bit, we went around the country. I didn't go, but a team of people went around the country listening to, what do you want to hear? What do you want in this act? And we heard from individuals, we heard from corporations, we heard from a whole lot of people what we wanted to hear. Sadly, I have to say, Stuart, that when it came to the timing was really poor. After 9 years of the Harper governments, in the organizations that represented people with disabilities were basically downsized and had no money and were lacking resources. So they were in a fighting mood. So whenever we went out in the government and started talking to them, all they wanted to tell us is how they needed money to get things done. And they weren't giving us too much useful information that we could turn around and produce a piece of legislation. So we really needed the input from people with disabilities. And in my book, we talk about how we did something really creative to address this fact. And I sat back and I told Minister Cultro, and at that time my boss, saying, okay, what are we going to do about this? And I said, give me about 48 hours and I'll come back with an idea. And the idea was, one of the great things about the federal government is that we have hundreds of people with disabilities working in the federal government at all levels, in all stripes, in all departments. So we can find somebody who knows the tax law for accessibility really well. We can find somebody who works in IT really well. Like we can find those folks really, really well. And so I said, let's do a conference where I find the hundred and so folks that are specialists in these fields, put them in a room together and start figuring out what should the act look like. And so the scary thing for your listeners is that when I proceeded to do this, it was so quick that I forgot to ask, a friend of mine. Well, actually, I asked a friend of mine, can you hire me a consultant that could do the consulting work and get the meat out of the people? But I forgot to ask that person, how are they going to do this?
Right.
So within hours of this event happening, I went back to my colleague and I said, hey, how is this going to look like? And he goes, oh, he plays with Legos. I'm like, he does what? And then and the room I had it in, it's a famous room here in Ottawa where if you're on Bank and Spark Street, you can look into this one part of the government offices and it's all glass. And so you would see about 175 disabled federal public servants playing with Legos. And all I could see is in the local press, federal public servants playing with Legos.
Right, right.
It was a momentous event because what ended up happening is we had, like I said, all stripes and all colors and all works of life in there with people with disabilities, really giving us an idea from every sector what needed to be done. And that's where we came up with, at the time, was 8 pillars. We shrunk it down to 7. And we now had the bones to the act. Now we had to figure out how to put the meat to it all. And so I like to say 2 things. Legos was the process and how we got this piece of legislation put together. And it was built by people with disabilities for people with disabilities. And I don't think there's any piece of legislation prior to this or currently that can say that for their population in which they're trying to help.
That's a great background for what the Accessibility Canada Act is and the advocacy and how it got formed, Max. And I appreciate that because I think one of the biggest challenges with any level of government when they come up with policy, they, typically it's done with best intentions, but usually voices that typically haven't been at the table. They've been silent. They haven't had an opportunity to participate. Those voices are not sometimes always heard when policy or legislation starts to be formed. So you're suggesting and saying that in the case of the Accessibility Canada Act, C-81, that's not the case. This was done by disability folks for people with disability. And so, that's a bit of a home run, if you will, for the ACA or the Accessibility Canada Act.
Yeah, and I will be frank in the sense that we did miss a few things. I mean, the new legislation that's coming out of Saskatoon or Manitoba, they had a whole part about with service animals. We forgot that, and which I said, oh man, we should have had that. The other thing that they were missing is AI. We never thought about AI. AI never came up in those discussions, but the internet was very much a focal point too, like how to make the internet more accessible. And that's why I added a chapter in my book specifically about AI. And then the other thing that we missed, but the Senate caught, and that was about episodic disabilities. And what episodic disabilities are, for anybody who's listening to this conversation, it's about anybody who comes up with cancer or breaks a leg or has some kind of element that puts them down or temporarily affects them for several months or several years. But once it's done, it's over and they get back to a normal kind of life, whatever a normal would be. But you get where I'm coming from. And we believe that it was really important to put episodic disabilities in this particular work as well.
So, Max, just to your point specifically, realizing that you forgot about service animals, were you able to sort of find a way to get that into the act?
No, it wasn't until I don't think there is anything yet that has been, nobody's really done a big push. There's been a big push to put something about AI. So the act now addresses that. I think that there needs to be something that needs to be added to that. But again, it cannot come up from me who doesn't use service animals. It needs to come up for the community and say, look, we need to shore this up. Can we put something about service animals in there? And I don't think the government would be hard pressed to say no. They would just say, try to figure out how to make that, happen.
Yeah, I know. I mean, like a lot of legislation, things change. I mean, as you say, it's hard to criticize any organization, that was looking at legislation. I mean, what year did this come in? C-81?
Well, C-81 came into effect. So it was 2019 when it was agreed upon to being assent. So it was like 6 months later. So wow, it would have been 20. So 2020, January the 1st, 2020 is when it came into effect.
Say 5 or 7 years ago.
Yeah, about 7 years ago.
Yeah. So, that, and, the part of, I guess that's a Freudian slip on my part, Max, but, I guess part of it, just to sort of bill myself out here a little bit, is to think that, with all of the work that's been done within the disability community and all the challenges and the advocacy, barrier-free environments, to think that this has only been done some 5 or so 6 years ago is a little troubling, I guess, because as you say, this has been a conversation that's been going on since you can ever remember.
Yeah, I mean, it was there before I was born. I was born in 1970, so it's been around this country probably since the root of this country, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't talk about too much about that in my book. I talk about the conversations with disability really began in 1967, but it really has been around for a lot longer. If you really, really trace this disability argument, people with disabilities used to be institutionalized, but back then the only institutions we had were prisons, and so people would go to institutions to be taken care of, and you can just imagine the mess that was. There's a whole history about the deaf culture and how we had deaf schools all across the country at one point, and how they were funded by the provinces, or at that time the territories. So there's a lot of history with disability in this country. It's just, I would say it started really culminating in the 80s. It's when we really started talking about what kind of pieces of legislation should be in place to ensure people with disabilities have a fair and equitable shot of having a nice and full life in Canada.
So, Max, one of the things that, you mentioned in your book, and anybody that does research about what the background to the Accessibility Canada Act is, it talks about this vision of being barrier-free in Canada by 2040. So now I can get my math right. Now that I got this figured out, we're 2025. We're about to turn the calendar to become 2026. That just seems to me to be one hell of a long ways away to accomplish what really should be everyday living for everyday people, if we do believe that people are all born with equality.
I agree. It is. Let's do some math. If you give people too long of a spectrum, then people will put it off anyways until the last 5 years anyways.
Right.
And my philosophy, and it wasn't me who made the final decision on this, but if you don't make it achievable within a generation or two, then people just put it off. So that's why it's 2040. And look, the reality of this situation is, are we going to have all of it done by 2040? I don't suspect it will be, right? I will expect that around 2040, there'll be some celebrations about how a lot has changed.
Sure.
The road still needs to be traveled, and a lot of things still need to be done. And so then at that time, and whoever's going to be kicking the bucket around that time can start honing in what the 5 pillars, might be. Instead of being 7, it might be 5, for example. right? And start honing in on the very, very specific things that need to be done. But I don't see some things disappearing as well.
Yeah, no, and I mean, I appreciate your thoughtful and respectful approach to the process. But Max, one of the things I don't know if you can bring out a crystal ball, if such a thing exists, and if you do have one, there's other things I might ask you after this podcast is over. But is there some aspect of the Accessibility Canada Act that you say, this one is going to be very difficult, or these two are going to be very difficult to actually achieve by 2040? Is there something that you would look at and say, this is where there may be a little bit of a challenge?
Well, one of them actually was, and that was with ASL and LSQ. LSQ, for anybody who's listening, is the equivalent to ASL, which is the French sign language interpreter's language or filing. And remember at the beginning, I said it was 8. And the 8th one was sign language. And that was to ensure that sign language was appropriately used by all federal institutions and all federal regulated organizations. And somewhere in between, and this had nothing to do with me, somebody went out and found out the math behind it. It said that the amount of money that would be put into ensuring that it would be a third language for Canada would be the same amount of money that we would put for wartime. And a lot of people got scared and they said, okay, why don't we just shrink that and put it into one of the communication pillars? But at the end of the day, I really do think we should have really explored that between you and I. And because if we look at our American cousins, and they're still doing it today, even though there's an anti-statement about people with disabilities there, you still see whenever there's an emergency, you will see somebody with sign language behind the governor or behind the person who's talking about the emergency. You even see music acts coming out of the United States where they actually hire somebody to be on the one side of the stage and is signing the music. So you're starting to see sign language is becoming kind of a universal language that everybody's buying into, if that makes any sense, right? And I fundamentally believe whenever our politicians go out there and do speeches, like, before I came on the air with you today, we had the prime minister talking about how he's going to aid some of the industries that are going to be infected. And, there's going to be people on disabilities that are going to be affected by that. And why isn't there a sign language interpreter? And the prime minister addresses the country, talks to the country. In my opinion, there should be a sign language interpreter beside him.
Yeah, you make a great point, Max. And what always I find fascinating, and I mean, I'm just a student of this. When I was the inaugural president and CEO of the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, we were doing a new build. So we were fortunate that when we went to the disability community, they were able to give us really good advice that we could put into the build as opposed to doing a retrofit, and that's always very, very difficult. But having said all of that, Max, the one element that always was in the back of my mind that every time we talked about an issue, whether it was a sign language or whether it was accessibility for washrooms, even though, the building we were in, the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, is a very complex building. And I think if I understand correctly, I believe the Canada Building Code would have allowed for 2 accessible washrooms in a building that frankly is very, very challenging to get around. And so we had to just make a decision to say that's just not the way it's going to be. There's going to be accessible washrooms on every level. But, the first reaction from the majority of people in the conversation is, how much is that going to cost? And I said, are you talking about financial terms or human terms? Like, let's make sure that we have a discussion that is not going to derail what we're doing simply from a money standpoint when you're talking about human dignity.
Well, here's a really interesting point. I had a conversation about a few years ago when I was working with the Act, and I was talking to the Builders Association of Ontario. And basically, they had recently done a study and said that the actual cost right from the start of building accessibility, right from the start that made sense, was only 2% more. Now, you go and buy a house, you go and have to retrofit the building. Now it's 20 to 30%.
Sure. Yeah.
Between you and I would rather deal with the 2% cost than deal with the 20 or 30% cost.
No, I couldn't agree with you more.
And I think what you guys did was great. You stuck to your guns and said, okay, we're going to put an accessible washroom on every floor. And I don't know if the listeners know, but there are more ramps in the Museum for Human Rights than anywhere else I've ever been. I'm glad I'm in an electric wheelchair, because if I had to huff that up, and my arms would have been nice and big, and I could have lifted my wife and said, "Woo!" But
Yeah.
I was in an electric wheelchair, so it was not an issue.
Yeah.
But I'm really amazed. You guys did a really good job with that.
Well, I mean, I'd love to sort of pat myself and my team on the back, Max, but the reality is, I think we found enough wisdom to say we need to listen and work with the community. Because I can tell you, the very first meeting we had with the disability community was not good, and we realized we were talking to them rather than listening from them, and I think that was a big experience that we learned. But at the end of the day, and I'm glad you brought it up, and thank you so much for visiting the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, Max. But the reality is, when we opened it in 2014, and I hope things have changed dramatically in the world since, but it was the most culturally accessible building in the world because of that fact.
And again, when I went in there, the current person who the curator of the museum, she was worried that there was still a lot of stuff to be done. And I'm like, look, this is the plague and the problem with people with disabilities, is that with new technology, with new advancements, you're constantly changing, you're constantly working with the change, right? And the best thing you could do as an organization is constantly work and have conversations with the community about what can be done and what could be done tomorrow. Because look, there's always things you could do today, and there's always things that you got to put off tomorrow, because it's going to cost millions of dollars to change. And like, for an example, I thought the museum was really beautifully well done, but there were some points of technology that I could see, wow, we could update this with this kind of technology, and we can update this with this kind of technology. But I realized one thing before I opened my mouth and I said that to her: by the time they institute it, it will already be grandfathered in because something new would have came out. Trying to stay ahead of the curve is a losing game, right? So you need to be able to come up with, for lack of term, my community is going to hate me saying this, kind of an acceptable, what can we achieve today, right? And then what can we keep in our eyes on for tomorrow?
Yeah, no, look, and Max, what I love about your approach and how how you wrote this in your book is you are passionate, you're an advocate, you have just a tremendous amount of leadership in what you do, but you take a very reasonable approach to try to achieve something that you bring people along with you rather than become, sort of having friction or having difficult conversations. You find a way to bring people along. And I think that is the measure of who you are personally.
Well, thank you. And my mother would really love to hear that, because she raised me to be that way. The reality is, as I go back to what you were saying earlier, I'm an individual with SMA, which affects me physically. I don't have a visual problem. I don't have a hearing impaired problem. So for me to sit here and talk to you about visually impaired or deaf community or neurodiverse, I feel much more comfortable if I bring a colleague of mine who represents that community and has that discussion. Because to me, I will never be able to address that to the best of what that community could do.
Yeah.
So my career has always been, I could talk about physical barriers very well. I could talk about employment very well, because that's very, omnidirectional, omni whatever. But when it comes to very specific disabilities, I always have a team of people that I bring with me that know how, why I'm bringing them along, is to make sure that voice is heard, right? Rival is make sure that voice is heard.
And so in your book, The Race to the Starting Line, Max, you talk about powerful personal stories. Share some of the stories that you would love to have listeners get a sense of so they can go out and purchase your book, The Race to the Starting Line.
Well, I mean, one of the things I did in my book is I brought a lot of other people into the book that brought in their stories and their fun stuff, if that makes any sense, right? So I don't know what particular story I would bring in personally, but I mean, I talk about the Lego one, which is my favorite one, by the way.
For sure, yeah.
But the other one I have is more personal. It's more about, going back to the human rights argument. When I was a younger lad, and I was watching a lot of my friends, getting jobs and doing, getting out of university and going to get to work. I had a conversation with my father when I was young, and he's like, it was my job to help interpret, what the Charter of Rights said. It was my job to go out there in the world and help, make people understand of what people with disabilities are looking for, to educate. And to be straightforward with you, when I got out of university, I went from being able to walk with crutches to all of a sudden I was confined to a wheelchair. I realized that that was my destiny, is to work with the community and help them go somewhere. And I've never looked back since.
Max, just for listeners, if you don't mind, just let's go real down a personal path for a second and talk about what spinal muscular atrophy is.
Okay. Spinal muscular atrophy, when I was younger, they didn't really know how to tell me what it was. They used to tell me, "Oh, you got a version of Lou Gehrig's disease." Right. And I'm a big baseball fan, by the way. So I knew, oh, okay, I know what Lou Gehrig's is, and then figured out, okay, I got a version of that. That is so far from the truth. What SMA is, it's for lack of terms, it's a neurological disability where my nerves over time literally die off. And so my muscles die off with my nerves. So I slowly lose my ability to function and do daily things. So when I was a younger lad, I was able to play rugby. Now I'm in an electric wheelchair. I definitely can't play rugby, or unless they change the rules and they allow electric wheelchairs in a scrum. But I don't think that will ever happen.
Right. Well, you never know. You never know, but I hear you.
But you hear me, right? And the point is that every few years, we call it the 7-year cycle, I'm constantly losing my muscle capacity. So from when I was a youth, I used to walk, to now where I can't walk. Where at one point I used to be able to get up, get dressed on my own. I can't anymore. So I'm constantly, losing my abilities to function. Now, here's the good news about me. I was just talking about my wife about this. I am recognized in this country to be the least affected by SMA compared to most people. And what I mean by that is I still had, up until my mid-20s, I was still walking and running and chasing and doing things on a physical level. I wasn't as strong as everybody else, but I still had an idea what it felt like to have legs underneath me and go upstairs and do all that kind of stuff. It wasn't until I was 26 that I was confined to a wheelchair because, to be honest with you, I enjoyed university too much that, a little bit of drinking and chasing. Again, I know the two worlds because of that.
Yeah.
And most people with SMA don't make it past their 40s.
Really? You're 55. Yeah.
Yeah. So the average person with SMA usually passes away in their 40s. And sadly enough, they usually don't die of SMA. They usually die of catching some kind of element like, pneumonia and all that kind of fun stuff. So when COVID hit, that was a really, really scary time for me because, if there was going to be something that was going to remove me from this planet, it would have been COVID infection right at the start.
Yeah, interesting.
So when they were talking about, ensuring the people that were going to be most vulnerable, I was one of those most vulnerable, if that makes any sense, right?
Yeah.
And I appreciate what everybody did, even though they argued and snipped about it. I still appreciated what people did. But at the end of the day, SMA is a trajectory of losing so much abilities that something else will take me out. Now, I'm going to make everybody laugh here. I'm also come from the Montreal area. And one of the reasons why I'm in my 50s with SMA is that the only group of people with SMA that have normal life expectancies are people from the Montreal Island, which I come from. And I just discovered that about 5 years ago. So, but majority of us don't live to see 50.
Okay, but Max, just on that point, I mean, that is worth at least a couple of questions. How is it that area is, the island of Montreal is able to produce, individuals with spinal muscular atrophy, SMA, but have had this long tenure?
Well, here's the honest goodness truth, Stuart. I created a foundation called the Max Brault SMA Foundation, which my book is running through, and I'm hoping over the next few years to raise several $1 million. And one of the number one projects I want to go back is I'm going to go back to the scientists in the Montreal area and go, instead of making this broad statement of this, can you actually show me the map behind this? It's just, for some odd reason, families that have existed in the Montreal Peninsula, is what they like to call it,
Yeah.
for more than about 5 or 6 generations, seem to have this weird mutation to the SMA strain.
Wow, that'll be a fascination, Max. I just think those things, you hear about them, and as you say, there's a lot of science behind it. So to get that information out, I think would be really, really fascinating. So I appreciate you sharing that. Thank you very much for that, Max. I wanted to just kind of come back again to the Canada Accessibility Act. Who is, if somebody were to look at that, and again, I always sort of think for people that are listening, if they wanted to get involved or they wanted to take some action, some of the questions they might ask would be, which offices would be responsible for the implementation for the C81 and the Accessibility Canada Act, and how is progress monitored?
Well, we did 3 things when we wrote the act. So we wrote 3 roles. So the first role is the Chief Accessibility Officer, which currently is housed by Stephanie Cadeau, and which she is with ESDC or HRSDC. They're the same organization. And what she does is she goes around the country and the world getting and finding examples of what kind of accessibility can we bring into Canada to ensure that anybody who has a question, she has a team of people that gets the best example. So that's one, right? And she represents not only the federal government, but she represents all 19,000 of the FORs.
So FORs
are the federal regulated organizations. Sorry. The other role we created, which to me is a very, very powerful role, is the Accessibility Standard Commission. So the CEO of that is a guy named Dino Sapo. And what he runs is the organization is going to look at 30,000 standards that Canadians use day to day. So everything from your toaster to your oven to your car to how you pump gas to every element that your life touches, they're going to look at all these standards and ensure that accessibility is embedded in it. And I've always said, when that was written, I always said, when everything is done and over with in about 100 years from now, that's going to be the organization that will make the biggest impact for people with disabilities in this country.
Interesting.
And the third one, which kind of makes sense, is the Chief Accessibility Officer. And that gentleman, which is a gentleman by the name of Christopher Stewart, or Sutton, sorry, he resides with the Canadian Human Rights Commission, the national version of that.
Right.
And what he does, and this is where the impact comes in, he is charged with all of the organizations that are FORs, right? What they need to do, what the Act says this, by the way, you need to write an accessible plan and how you're going to eliminate the barriers. So every organization you can think of, you name it, TELUS, Rogers, you name it, all the big organizations need to have a plan. Even all the small ones need to have a plan. And they need to make it public. That's the other thing. And they need to give it a copy to the Canadian Human Rights Commission. And they evaluate that. The last time I talked to Christopher, 44% of all the large organizations, so like the TELUS's, the Rogers, whatever you want to call them, right? Only 44% of them have submitted their plans.
Okay, so Max, is 2 questions. One is there a deadline for these companies, for organizations, wherever they may be, whatever size, to submit plans? And secondly, is there a penalty if organizations do not do that?
Now, there's the great question. Yes, there was an end date, which was about 2 years ago. Now the problem is that in the Act, we do say that organizations that don't submit one would be charged some kind of penalty. The problem is we're still waiting for the federal government to create that element of the plan. And right now, the way that the world is going, I don't see that happening, to be straightforward with you. And so, again, you're looking at the generosity of organizations to do this. But I would argue, if you're a bank, for example, not Rogers, like CIBC or
Scotiabank, Bank of Montreal. Yeah.
TD Bank.
Yeah.
Want to put that out there because you want to demonstrate that you acknowledge the services in which you're giving are accessible, or the ones where people complain about, that you're going to be addressing them. So at the end of the day, from a bank or a credit union, this is really important from a consumer point of view. Because for me now, I can tell anybody who's a consumer, I won't spend my money somewhere unless I know they have a plan. Right? You can turn around and go, oh yeah, wait a sec. Scotiabank does nothing about people with disabilities. I shouldn't not use them because they do a lot. I'm going to go to TD Bank because they advertise the heck out of this.
Right. And so just on that point, Max, how would people know, people that are listening saying, okay, listen, that's something I can get behind. I mean, that's something I can support and take action on. How would people find out which organizations have a strategy or a plan to deal with the Accessibility Canada Act?
Well, you can do two things. You can go on the internet, and the institution in which you want to do business with, go to their website and ask for in the question saying, where is their accessibility plan? It should pop up right away, or it should be on their whatever their menu is. Because one of the other things that the Act says, it has to be easily found and right on their front page. Go to AI and just say, AI. Go to chat on this a few times, going, hey, can you tell me where I can find X amount of corporations with their plans? And then it gives me the website. Boom, 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 where I can find them.
So this is a bit of a pivot, Max, but I know you have a lot of professional advocates that deal with other issues. You talk about ChatGPT. Is it accessible from your perspective, or people that have issues with sight?
I would say no. Between you and I would look. AI is a magical thing. I'm going to be honest with you. It's an incredibly magical tool. I had a colleague of mine who was in the federal government. He retired since, and his name was actually Jeff Stark, not Tony Stark. So he's not an Avenger. Anyways, he was, and he told me one day that what ChatGPT was doing for him was decreasing the amount of work he had to put day in to day out, because he was blind, and all the forms he was doing and all the stuff he was doing on the computer was made for people like you and I, or visually. He's and added another 2 to 3 hours worth of work every day for him. So a normal day for you and I might be 7.5, but for him it was 10 to 11 hours a day, right? But for him, what ChatGPT did is it made that extra 2 or 3 hours 5 minutes more of work for him. It really helped him in using that technology to be able to do his job with forms and all that kind of fun stuff. And from my point of view, I'm a big advocate. I support AI to the degree, to the point that I think federal and provincial governments, when they're talking about national building things we need to do as a country, one of the first things they should be doing right now, and I'm hoping that they start hearing me on this, is invest in students in the universities and colleges with disabilities and getting involved in the AI technology. Because the more we have this community building it and designing it and doing the fun stuff with this, the odds are either we will have more accessible AI stuff. Because the reality is, it's about data. And AI right now, right, when you ask a question, it goes to all the data banks that it taps into. And I guarantee you the majority of data banks that it's tapping into does not have a majority of stuff about accessibility.
Yeah, it's a great point. Let's hope that, I mean, you've had a voice, Max, where people have listened. I mean, organizations, governments have listened to you. Let's hope that they listen to this one, because that makes a lot of sense, because you're trying to, as you say it, because I'm going to ask you because I think you answered this question, but like the race to the starting line, how did you come up with that book? Because to me, the way you just explained how you get AI into students with disabilities speaks very much about what you're talking about with the name of your book. But in your words, how did you come up with the name of your book?
I got to be honest with you. I struggled with the name of my book for a while, and a colleague of mine by the name of Dean Emmerich came up with it. And his logic was, everything I was saying to him was like, remember when I was saying that the Minister Cultural, she was given a letter and said you had to do it in X amount of time. We had to do it in 4.5 years. We had to get it done, written, approved, ascended in 4.5 years. No piece of legislation I know of, 90% of pieces of legislation I know, usually have one or two administrations around before they become a piece of legislation.
Right.
And it's only the emergency ones that they do it really
Sure.
quickly. They're really poorly written, to be honest with you,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So this one, in this case, we didn't have a lot of time. And so the logic my friend gave it to me was you didn't have a lot of time. So all you were doing is giving everybody to be ready to deal with their rights. Again, my book is about explaining to everybody what are your rights as a person with a disability. Once you know your rights, now you got to go and do something about it. And again, the discussion was always, where does the ball land in this conversation? This is the conversation we were having all the time. We were always trying to make sure we were giving the right footing, the right situation for people with disabilities to know what their rights are so they can have the strength and feel that the government is backing them up so they can make changes. And that's what the name is basically the race to the starting line was me talking about how the act was put together so that now we put the ball into the court that belongs to you.
Yeah. So what a great way to, as we sort of wrap up this conversation, Max, to let our listeners know. I mean, I think, I try to say in this podcast, it's an advocacy education podcast around human rights. You've done both of those things. You're an advocate, you're an educator. But if people are saying, well, I'd like to know, how could I get involved? Like I'm a person, whether I have a disability or I do not. But this is such an important initiative to humanize who we are, to feel kind of this sense of pride about who we are as Canada. How would who are some leaders that you say people should reach out to? And maybe other than politicians, maybe only politicians, but from your perspective, if people want to take action on this issue, what would you recommend they do?
So the first thing I tell everybody is when you are arguing or picking a fight or want to bring up an issue, bring it as an issue that comes from your heart. Because at the end of the day, you want to be able to argue it and feel what you're doing. Because just showing up and saying, Stuart, I don't like the color of your background, I'm going to fight for that. That doesn't make sense. But I love music, for example, and I use this as an example all the time. Prior to COVID, I used to be able to get great seating because there was really a good system. Somehow after COVID, it's near impossible for me to get great seating. So if you're like me and you really like your music and you want to get better seating, go and fight those people that are instrumental in making sure that the locations are more accessible, the seating is more accessible. Go talk to, more likely it's a municipal thing, not a federal thing. Go talk to the municipal people about that. Go talk to the province. Again, it's a provincial thing. Go talk to the province. But again, find the people with the like-minded issue that you have and start building a coalition of a voice behind that. And then go and find all the politicians and the people and go and do that. But, and I'll say there's a big but, research your situation, understand your situation, because everybody will always tell you, well, who's going to come up with the money? Always have an answer for some kind of quip like that. Because at the end of the day, and I'm going to say this to all your listeners, money is not the end all be all. There is a lot of ways to do things, and you do not have to rely on money to get things done.
That's great. And listen, I can't let this one go because I also love music. And on your website, by the way, you talk about some of your supporters, and there's some musicians there that are supporting you, Max. Can you maybe clarify for a second? You said that before COVID, you used to get really good seating. After COVID, not so much. If did I understand you to say that correctly? And if I did, why is that the case?
I don't know. I'll give you a really great example. I went and saw a band called Sum 41. They just had their last concert in Toronto, and I bought wheelchair accessible seating, right? But you know what the band did? The band make sure that nobody could buy the two front rows in front of the disabled seating. Anybody stood up, I could still see the stage.
Right.
Right. And I was like, holy crap, that's really, really cool.
No kidding.
I'm a big fan of Foo Fighters. And every time I wanted to go see the Foo Fighters, they're they don't have an accessibility seating. Like they don't think special. And that really bugged the heck out of me. Like I love their stuff. And every time I could go and talk to somebody about, can you make sure it's, I get a better, you put a stage, just in the general audience, just a little bit off to the side that I have a better view. They're like, well, the band doesn't want that. And I guarantee you, it's not the band.
Right.
And between you and I, it's the institution. It's the organization that's running them or managing them that don't care because they got so much other things. So it's a matter of getting to the voice of the person who's going to make the decision in favor of the band.
Yeah.
And I'll be honest with you, it was the same time I was flying. When I was flying before COVID, I had great service. I was lifted up with the lift. I was brought to my chair. I was dropped to my chair. I had an extraordinary amount of great services. I could fly all over the world and it was fantastic. After COVID, it's like they took that book that had how to accommodate people with disabilities and threw it in the grinder.
Yeah, so first and foremost, I bet, Max, if you reached out through your foundation to David Grohl at Foo Fighters, I bet you he would respond to you. Maybe you have already. I don't know.
No, I haven't yet.
Okay, but I'm just saying he's the kind of person that would understand what you're saying, I believe. And then just coming back to this whole thing with the airlines, I've done a couple of other podcasts with folks in chairs, and one of them, in particular from Winnipeg, said he's surprised that every time he travels with the airlines, they basically ruin his chair. They always give him a substitute, but you're saying that's not my chair. My chair is part of my body. But as he was making the point in the podcast, is Air Canada's been able to figure out how to transport horses safely, but they haven't been able to figure out how to do that for humans. And so, again, why after COVID would they throw that out, Max? What's that all about?
And you're using my and Ziv's line, by the way, and she has a great line saying, "We know how to ship champion horses all over the world and in the country, but we can't do it for people with disabilities." The reality is that I don't know. One person explained to me it's a cost expenditure. We only represent a percentage of the population that uses their services, so we don't make money for them. We don't generate income for them. And the last time I sat on the Hill on this particular topic, I wanted to I wanted to hit them hard in between the eyes, right? And I fundamentally believe that my rights to access the airlines is a human rights issue. And to the point that it's a human rights violation if they destroy my equipment. Because when I go onto the airlines, when I go onto an Air Canada or WestJet and I give them my wheelchair, because I give them my wheelchair, right? It is a contract that I'm making with them that my wheelchair would be in the same condition at the other place because it's my legs.
Sure it is.
Wherever I go, if I don't have that functioning, I am in trouble because I don't know what to do. That's a human rights violation. And I fundamentally believe that if we turn it into a violation of human rights, boy, oh boy, are the airlines going to flip really quickly. And because all of a sudden, it's now a massive issue across the board. Oh, it's no longer just give that guy $20,000 and shut him up.
Yeah. Yeah. And you know what, Max, I hope that happens because I do think that, we get into a lot of box checking about we've done this, we've done that. We're looking at getting this done. We're having a meeting about this. We're having a meeting about that. We're talking about getting things done by a certain time frame. And, there's really no sort of accountability. And, the notion that people with disabilities should not have the same experience of those with ability is preposterous. And if it comes down to finances, somebody should have the cojones to stand up and say, that's the reason. Because if they did that, they would be booed and hissed as they should be. Because that's basically, again, I come back to this comment. Are you talking about, the financial impact or the human impact? And how is it that financial impact trumps human impact?
Now, here's a really, really cool story about this, right? When the act came into being, something magical happened. All the years that I've been working with people with disabilities prior to the act, I was working with the number 4%. I would go and talk to people like you saying the community represented 4% of the population, right? Well, when the act came into play, Stats Canada finally woke up and said, let's take a new look at the population with disabilities. And they came back and it said that 27% of the Canadian population now has self-identified as having a disability.
Wow.
Now, let's put this in a really interesting point of view. What is the average percentage that a federal party needs to achieve in order to get majority in this country? 42%.
Right.
Think about that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And 27% of Canadians self-identify with people with disabilities. And yet when I look at all the stuff they're doing for people with disabilities, doesn't represent 27% of the taxes.
Yeah. No, listen, Max, I love that. And, maybe you have another career in you before you call it a wonderful journey, a life journey. Max Brault, I just can't thank you enough. Author of The Race to the Starting Line, your ability to write, your ability to advocate, to educate, to be passionate, and to allow people to learn from you, as I have done during this podcast. I want to just say thank you so much for taking time to join me on Humans on Rights. And I hope at some time our paths will cross personally, because I'd love to be able to see you and take a selfie, especially with that awesome bow tie that you're wearing.
Thank you for having me on board. I'm always around anytime you want to talk.
Thanks for listening to Humans on Rights. A transcript of this episode is available by clicking the link in the show notes of this episode. Humans on Rights is recorded and hosted by Stuart Murray. Social media marketing by Buffy Davey. Music by Doug Edmond. For more, go to humanrightshub.ca.
Produced and distributed by the Sound Off Media Company.